Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 61, The Poisoning. Acknowledgement to Colette McAlpine, who wrote a story on Catherine Adams for the Female Convict Research Centre, Incorporated, in 2019. The centre is an amazing source of female convict information, and they have given me permission to reference this information to help create this episode. On Wednesday the 15th of May 1895, there was a Royal Commission case that commenced in Sydney, known as the Dean Royal Commission. George Dean stood accused of poisoning his wife Mary, the daughter of Catherine Adams. Poison had been found in Mary's food, and Dean was charged in early March 1895, and the court case commenced in the same month. Mary's parents have a story of their own, so I'm going to commence this episode with the story of Catherine Adams, Mary Dean's mother. Catherine Adams was born either Caroline or Catherine Adams. She was also known throughout her life as Kitty Adams, Caroline Edwards, and Carrie or Caroline Seymour. Based on Catherine's convict record, she was born in 1830 in Kentish Town, Middlesex, England. She was convicted of larceny from a person, stealing a gold watch, and picking pockets at the Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey, on the 21st of November 1851. She was a laundress. She'd had no previous convictions and stated she was married. Her convict indent stated she was married to Michael Adams in Kentish Town. However, there is a petition a couple of weeks after her conviction on the 4th of December 1851, where her father, John Adams, stated his daughter Catherine had lived with us until 15 months ago. So her birth name was Adams. Whether she had married a Michael Adams and it was just a coincidence it was the same surname, it is hard to tell. Her record also stated she'd been picking pockets for 3 months and had been on the town for 2 years. She was 22 at the time of her conviction, and she was known in England as an undesirable person. She was transported on the ship Sir Robert Seppings, leaving England on the 17th of March 1852 and arriving in Van Diemen's Land on the 8th of July 1852 under a sentence of 7 years. She was assigned to the brickfields in Hobart once she arrived, and also to 2 homes in her first month there. She was then assigned to the police magistrate's office from November 1852. She was granted her ticket of leave quite early on the 1st of August 1854 and actually received a certificate of freedom only a little over 2 years after she arrived on the 7th of October 1854. She was free by servitude on the 24th of November 1858, in which her sentence expired, and it seems that she had a pretty clean record. Catherine married a policeman who was also an ex-convict by the name of John Asprey in Hobart. He'd been born in 1825 in Middlesex, London, the son of a saddler. He was convicted of larceny from a person, stealing a purse, and pickpocketing at the Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey, on the 3rd of April 1848, when he was 22. He had previous convictions and he spent 3 months in Newgate Prison before this offence. He was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land and sailed on Maria Somes on the 3rd of May 1850, arriving in Van Diemen's Land on the 9th of August 1850. He stated in the later Royal Commission that he came as a ticket of leave man. However, the record stated he received his ticket of leave on the 27th of May 1851, so 12 months after his arrival, and he obtained his certificate of freedom only 2 years later on the 3rd of April 1853. He also had a relatively clean conduct record. When he first came out, his master was Judge Horn and also Police Magistrate Burgess, and he must have impressed them with his conduct as John became a sergeant of police by 1853. On the 18th of October 1852, he and Catherine Adams requested permission to marry, and that was only 2 months after Catherine had arrived in Van Diemen's Land and no doubt had met each other as they were both based at the police magistrate's office. The permission to marry was granted 7 months later, and they married on the 2nd of May 1853 at St George's Church at Battery Point. They both stated they were 22. Catherine, in fact, was 23 and John 27, based on their conviction information. John Asprey and Catherine Adams had a daughter on the 24th of May 1854 in Hobart. They named her Caroline Elizabeth. John Asprey was listed as a police sergeant at the time of Caroline's birth. So John Asprey was a policeman until 1855, and then he started to run hotels. So in September 1855, he ran the Webb's Hotel for 7 months, then the Derwent Hotel in March 1857, and from August 1857, the Garrick's Head Hotel. On the 10th of June 1858, there was an advertisement in the paper, to publicans and others, the Garrick's Head, Liverpool Street, to let. The undersigned, wishing to proceed to England, is anxious to let the above well-known house upon most liberal terms. The rent has been considerably reduced, and the incoming tenant will have the advantage of taking the house with all the furniture and fittings, as the advertiser does not require to remove one article but the family clothing. John Asprey. John did not go back to England, nor did he take his wife and child to England. As in the Royal Commission, he recalls what he did after he had put that advertisement out. So it says, in 1858, I came to Sydney under the advice of Superintendent Singleton, who died at Albury. I joined the detective force here, but did not stay here because my wife wouldn't join me. She said that the Sydney climate was too hot for her. While I was here, I had a share in a £200 reward for a crime that I helped bowl out. So he returned to Tasmania, and it seems that he commenced in another pub. So from November 1859 until mid-1869, he was the proprietor of the Emu Tavern. And whilst he was at the Emu Tavern, he owned arsenic and he'd been violently ill. Years later, he suggested in the commission that perhaps his wife had poisoned him. So Catherine, now known as Carrie, at the time that she'd married John, left John and her daughter and went to Melbourne on the Derwent on the 5th of July 1865. And in August 1865, John put an ad in the paper. Notice, my wife having left the colony, I will not be answerable for any debts contracted by her after this date. So quite often spouses would place that in the paper, pretty much telling the public that their spouse had deserted them. So Catherine came to Ballarat on her arrival in Victoria under her married name, Carrie Asprey. She teamed up with Biddy Birch and Daniel Gaynor, who was also known as Danny Gaynor, Dennis Edwards or John Edwards. Daniel Gaynor was born in 1835 in England and sailed out on the Lady Hoskins to Sydney in 1856 and then went on to Melbourne on the City of Melbourne in 1865. Together, the three shoplifted and picked pockets, and it was said that Carrie had planned and carried out the robberies. The group then moved on to Melbourne where they lived together. It was recalled that once in a hotel in Richmond that the landlord's back was only turned for 10 seconds before Carrie was away with a cash box containing £38. Superintendent O'Callaghan of the Victorian Police recalled Carrie taking men with her to brothels and afterwards seen the men when they complained that she had bilked them. He described Carrie in her time in Melbourne as very dangerous and vindictive and one who would not stop at any crime to gain her object. Catherine, under the name Caroline Asprey, was charged with feloniously receiving goods on the 15th of September 1867. She stated she was born in England in 1836. It was more so like 1830, and it stated that she'd had 2 previous convictions. She received 12 months in Melbourne jail and was released on the 29th of December 1867. Meanwhile, John Asprey arrived in Melbourne. He slightly changed his surname to Ashbury, and it was also referred to as Asprey in other cases. And he arrived in mid-1869 with his daughter Caroline. Catherine then claimed their child at this time. Caroline went on to marry William Henry Brown in Ballarat in Victoria in 1870 when she was 16, less than a year after arriving in Victoria. William was a draper who was born in England and was 26 when they married. They had one daughter, Edith Alice, born in 1874, and Caroline died in Williamstown in May 1891, aged only 36. She listed her parents as John Asprey and Carol Seymour. And it seems that Caroline married William Henry Brown fairly soon after being in the company of her mother, and it didn't seem that she had much contact with her mother after that time. In fact, John Asprey stated in the commission hearing in 1895, "I have a daughter, young Carrie. God send she may be alive. She's 41 to this very day, being born at 8 a.m. on the Queen's birthday. She's a lady, well educated, speaks 3 languages and used to play in the choir at Williamstown. The last time her mother went to see her, she shut the door on her. She's a lady, young Carrie." So he clearly did not know that his daughter had died 4 years previously. Now, before John Asprey left Tasmania, he had commenced a relationship with Winifred Goulf Dalwood after Carrie left in 1865. So Winifred would have been about 18 and John 37. There's an article in October 1865 that states that Winifred was living at John's pub and in service to John at the Emu Tavern, and had been employed by him for 2 years and 8 months. So she had actually been employed at the time that Catherine was living with John and their child. Winifred had arrived in Tasmania as a 7-year-old in September 1854 with her parents and siblings. Winifred and John had 3 children together in Tasmania, a daughter, Mary Alice, in 1866, and twin boys, James and John, in 1868. And it's presumed she also helped bring up Catherine and John's daughter, Caroline. Winifred and their children also made the move with John Asprey from Tasmania to Victoria. So after arriving in Victoria, John Asprey kept the Commercial Hotel in Little Bourke Street, Melbourne, and it seems that him and Carrie crossed paths, but not for good reasons. On the 17th of April 1869, there was an article titled "A Nice Party of Criminals." A very nice party of criminals was convicted for trial from the City Court on Saturday. They were Francis Cleary and William Astede, who had hung about a warder at the Melbourne jail named Cosgrove on the night of the 8th of March until they found opportunity to rob him of everything he had. And 2 others, John Asprey, landlord of the Commercial Hotel, and Winifred Dalwood, a woman who lives with him as his wife, who were charged with receiving part of the property, that is a gold watch valued at £20, knowing it to have been stolen. If the evidence of a girl named Cleary, sister of one of the prisoners, is to be believed, the men who robbed Cosgrove sold the watch, chain and locket to the master of the Commercial for £2. Certain it is that the female prisoner induced a sailor to take the watch to Launceston and endeavour to get it sold at auction. But the man thought over it a little and came to the conclusion that the property was stolen, and so carefully restored it to Dalwood without having attempted to sell it. Some days after this, a detective induced the woman to confess that she had the watch concealed and that Asprey knew all about it. He found the article sewn up in a bed, and that the prosecutor at once identified it as his. And in the commission there was reference to this case. It says, "After a while a gold watch was stolen from Cosgrove, and Mrs. Asprey," so that's meaning Catherine, Mrs. Asprey, "learned from her daughter that her father had the watch secreted under one of the beds. She accordingly informed Detective Forster, who arrested the whole gang. Several of them got 7 years apiece, and Asprey got 3, but Mrs. Asprey did not get the hotel licence she anticipated." So what this is alluding to is that Carrie set them up, and her plan was that if she had John and Winifred out of the way, that she would be able to take over the Commercial Hotel as her own, being the lawful wife of John Asprey. So it also says it was openly stated at the time that the information upon which John Asprey was arrested was supplied to Forster by Carrie Asprey. John Ashbury, he's referred to as in this article, and Winifred Dalwood, alias Ashbury, were charged with receiving stolen property, a gold watch and chain, and some loose silver. The prosecutor stated it was on the night of the 18th of last month, where they were looking for a place in Greens Lane, and Cleary, who met him, pointed out the place. But the man whom he wished to see being out, they went to the Commercial Hotel and the Horse and Jockey Hotel. They had drinks at both places, and subsequently, while the prosecutor was going up Commercial Lane with 3 or 4 men, the prisoners, Cleary and Eastdeed, being 2 of them, he was knocked down and robbed of his watch and chain and money. 3 of the men held him down until the 4th called out, "All right," and he was let go. It was proved that the 2 prisoners were seen going up the lane. Detective Forster stated that the watch was found in a bed in a bedroom at the Commercial Hotel, which was kept by the prisoner Ashbury. The female prisoner who lived with Ashbury pointed out the watch and told the detective not to tell Ashbury that she had showed him where it was. The first two were accused of assaulting Cosgrove, the warder at the jail, and stealing his watch, and John and Winifred from receiving stolen articles. And as a result, John Ashbury was sentenced to 3 years jail, and Winifred Delwood was sentenced to 6 months jail for receiving stolen property. And they were jailed in May 1869. John's sentence was shortened by 6 months. He received 2.5 years all up. At this point, John and Winifred had 3 children, and those 3 children came with them to Victoria. So we now have a situation where both parents are being incarcerated at the same time. So one of the twin boys, James Alfred Ashbury, he was born on the 11th of November 1868, and he died at 9 months old on the 22nd of September 1869. So while both parents were in jail. The oldest child, Mary Alice, would have been 3 when her parents were jailed, and I cannot find any other records that exist other than her birth in Tasmania. It is quite possible that Mary Alice died in Tasmania and didn't arrive with them to Victoria. However, the other twin, John Thomas, who was born under the surname Ashbury but listed as a state ward in Victoria under the name Delwood, was admitted due to being neglected on the 11th of May 1870, aged only 16 months. Little John had bruises on his face and body upon admission, and his demeanour was described as indifferent and his clothes described as bad. It stated that he'd been in the care of Mr. Edward Chandler, a fishmonger of Hotham, from November 1869. He was listed as illegitimate on his record. However, John Ashbury was listed as his father, and it stated that his father was incarcerated in 1869. However, it stated that Winifred had gone straight to New Zealand after John Ashbury's conviction. Winifred, in fact, was also sent to jail in May 1869 for 6 months. She was released on the 14th of August 1869, and then she moved to New Zealand. So hence why her boy was placed into the care of Edward Chandler, as she had left Australia and left her son 2 months before it was stated that he was in his care. Once Winifred moved to New Zealand, she married William Shakespeare in August 1871 and had a son to him, William George Shakespeare, in about 1875 at Reefton on the west coast of New Zealand. It seems William Shakespeare died around 1886, as Winifred was recorded as marrying James Playfair Taylor in New Zealand in December 1887. James was a miner in the Otago district, and they had moved from New Zealand to Victoria in about 1900, as James's death is recorded in Melbourne in August 1900. So Winifred had had 3 children to John Ashbury, had brought up a stepdaughter, had then deserted that family and moved to New Zealand, married twice and had a child. John Playfair Taylor's death record. Taylor, on the 25th of August at his residence, 310 Spencer Street, the son of the late James and Margaret Nicholson Taylor of Scotland and dearly beloved husband of Winifred Taylor, after a long and painful illness, late of Lake Wakatipu, New Zealand, aged 57. Winifred herself died on the 31st of July 1916 in West Melbourne. Something that I can't quite work out was there was a notice of sale, and it was not placed in the paper until February 1935, so a good 15 years after the death of Winifred, and it mentions Winifred Taylor, wife of James Playfair Taylor of South Melbourne, Victoria, brewer, as registered proprietor, and Winifred Taylor, 190 Stewart Street, East Brunswick, Victoria, as owner. So this was a notice of sale. I'm wondering whether Winifred's son, William George Shakespeare, would have been bestowed this as part of her will and kept that business left in their name until 1935. William George Shakespeare, Winifred's son, actually took on the surname Taylor, and this was evident in a memorial notice to his mother. It says, Taylor, in loving memory of my dear mother, Winifred Taylor, who died on the 31st of July 1916, inserted by her loving son, William George Taylor. William had married Doris Owen in Victoria in 1916, when George was 41 and Doris 22. They had 4 children. He was an electrical engineer, and he was the sole recipient of his mother's will. William died in June 1937 in East Brunswick, Victoria, aged 63. His wife returned to her home state of Tasmania and remarried when she was 46. So getting back to Catherine Adams, we know that we've got her husband, who she had deserted, living in Melbourne at this time. And we know that Catherine had been imprisoned and had been associating with Daniel Gaynor and others. So on the 6th of July 1869, the title of the article saying wholesale purloining. Anne Griffith, the wife of the man Griffith now serving his sentence for the celebrated silk robbery, was brought up at the Fitzroy Court yesterday in company with a woman named Caroline Edwards on the charge of stealing boots from the establishment of Mr. McGlone in Smith Street, Collingwood. So just a note, Caroline seems to have a habit of taking on the aliases of her partners, and Edwards was also one of Daniel Gaynor's alias surnames. The women entered the shop together on Friday last. Edwards was fitted with a pair of boots. Mr. McGlone and his sister were serving Edwards and another customer, and the woman Griffith managed unobserved to pick up 3 pairs of boots out of a trunk and stow them in a bag under her dress. While trying to abstract a 4th pair, she was detected by Mr. and Miss McGlone and was given into custody together with Edwards. When they were taken back to the watch house, Mrs. Griffith sent for a man, ostensibly to obtain bail for her, and gave him a note which the watchkeeper, with commendable smartness, demanded to see. It was addressed to a female accomplice, asking her to remove certain goods out of the way, and her home would probably be searched. She also asked her acquaintance to sell the articles that she had stolen from various shops in Fitzroy. Sergeant Doyle immediately went to the house, accompanied by Mrs. Griffith, and they found a roll of red flannel and a quantity of Crimean skirting. There was also hat feathers, crochet work, and 2 pairs of ladies' boots. It's believed that the whole of this property had been stolen, and both Griffith and Edwards were sentenced to 3 months hard labour for the robbery of the boots and were remanded for a week on the charge of stealing other articles found. It may be mentioned that Mrs. Edwards' husband was serving a sentence for stealing a watch, so that both women are the wives of felons. So they knew who Carrie was, despite the name that she used, that she was in fact John Asprey's wife. A few months later, in September 1869, Daniel Gaynor was convicted of vagrancy and for stealing money, and he was sentenced to 3.5 years jail. He was released on the 29th of July 1874, so a little longer than his sentence, as he was reconvicted whilst in jail. It was in 1874 that Catherine Adams gave birth to Mary Dean. Mary Dean was in fact born Sarah Annie Gaynor at Rosebank Cottage in West Melbourne, Victoria. Sarah's birth certificate stated her parents were Caroline Adams and Dennis Gaynor, so Catherine and Daniel both using aliases on the birth record. It also stated on Mary's birth certificate that Carrie and Danny had married on the 2nd of May 1867. However, this can't be true for 2 reasons. First of all, Carrie was still legally married to John Asprey, but Carrie was also in jail on this date. Carrie did live with Danny at this address and went under the name of McEwen as well, and that name McEwen was used while she was pregnant with Mary. Daniel Gaynor had an extensive jail record from 1874 to 1884. The record stated that he also went under the aliases of George Adams and George James. His offences were mainly larceny, and his stints in jail were anywhere from 3 months to 3 years. While Daniel Gaynor was in and out of jail, Carrie commenced a relationship with a man called Jerry Scanlon, and I found an article in a newspaper stating that Jerry Scanlon was actually an alias. His real name was John Howell. He was a professional pickpocket, and he also went under the alias of Burrows, and he'd received 5 years hard labour in Darlinghurst Jail in 1879. So definitely a man that was around in the same circles. She then went on to have a relationship with Billy Gamble in Melbourne, and he was known by his alias surname Millet. So Catherine, under the name Caroline Edwards, one of Daniel Gaynor's alias surnames, was convicted of 3 cases of larceny in July 1869 and sentenced to a total of 9 months jail. On her record, it actually stated she had an alias of Asprey as well. This sentence was based on an outstanding warrant. Her jail record stated she was born in 1834 in London, so again she's making herself 4 years younger than what she actually is. On her record, under previous history, she stated she'd come to Tasmania with her parents when she was a child. So part of that information was true. Yes, she was in Tasmania. However, she clearly was omitting her convict past in Victoria, so there couldn't be any more evidence of previous convictions added to her sentence. So Catherine was jailed at Pentridge, and she was released on the 24th of February 1870, a little bit early after serving 7.5 months. Meanwhile, we know with John Asprey that Winifred had left John and gone to New Zealand and moved on to have marriages and children of her own over there. Well, John Asprey, he commenced a relationship with Isabella McCall, and they were charged together in 1873. Isabella McCall went also under the alias of Isabella Gayler. So on the 18th of November 1873, an article titled Housebreaking. John Asprey, Isabella Gayler and Charles Wright were arraigned for breaking into the house of a man named Brown, a resident of Hotham, and stealing a quantity of wearing apparel. The offence was alleged to have been committed on the morning of the 27th of October. The prisoners, Asprey and Gayler, resided a few doors away from the prosecutor, and it was supposed the prisoners, taking advantage of the temporary absence of Brown, entered the premises and abstracted the clothing. Mentions also in the article that Isabella Gayler has a number of aliases. The apparel was valued at £10, and it was proven that they were the perpetrators as the property was pawned at several places and was traced back to them. John Asprey was sentenced to 8 years in prison, and Isabella was sentenced to 2.5 years prison with hard labour. Isabella McCall named herself Isabella Taylor on her jail record, but next to it were also other aliases, Elizabeth Gaylor, Sarah Taylor, and had alias surnames of Scott and Asprey. She stated on her jail record she was born in Ireland in 1833, that she was married. I don't know whether that was alluding to her unofficial marriage to John Asprey or whether she was legally married to another man. This was the 5th time that she had received a sentence, and she was released on the 27th of October 1875. And there doesn't seem to be any other records of Isabella in connection to John Asprey once this jail stint was over, and John obviously was in for a lot longer than she was. Catherine Adams's last criminal charge in Victoria was on the 13th of February 1877, in which she received 12 months. She was released early on the 29th of December 1877, and remember at this time she was in a relationship with Billy Gamble. Well, Billy Gamble moved to Sydney in 1878, and Catherine, under the name of Caroline Seymour, one of Daniel Gaynor's alias surnames, moved to Sydney to be with Billy Gamble with her daughter and set up a shop selling fruits, lollies and cordials in Riley Street, Surrey Hills. Billy Gamble died not long after Carrie moved to Sydney. It was suggested that the home and the store was frequented by criminals, and there were claims that she would move girls from her residence to a house of questionable character across the road. It was also suggested that Mrs. Seymour would say to individuals that it'd be worth their while to bring any nice young girls to her house. So with Billy Gamble passing away around 1878, Tommy Jones became her new partner in 1882, and he lived with and worked with Carrie. It was reputed that she was the one that stole and he was her fence. John Asprey was released from his 8-year sentence in Victoria on the 14th of January 1890, and he makes his way to New South Wales. So in the commission, he recollects what he did after his release. It says that he went for a few days to Williamstown to stay with his daughter, Caroline. He then went to Deniliquin for a few days. He crossed the Old Man Plain and went to the 90 Mile Hay. He stayed there for a few days and then went up to the Murrumbidgee to work as a cook at Toggen Main and Berrinbar for a few months. He then went to the diggings at Temora and made a lot of money and spent it. Moving through New South Wales, he was known under the name of Jack Jenkins and Johnny the Londoner. And at this time, he had received food poisoning from tinned meat when he was working on Mr. McPherson's station 10 miles from Balranald. And he states in the commission that he started thinking about the link between where he suspected that Carrie had poisoned him at their time at the Emu Tavern in Tasmania. He said, the symptoms I experienced were the same as I had before, and that set me piecing things together. I recalled the incidents of the arsenic bottle and what I'd suffered on the previous occasion. It was imprinted in my memory because I was never so near death. It preyed on my mind so much that I brooded until I lost my senses and was eventually arrested at Narrandera as a madman and remanded at Gladesville. So in 1893, it was stated that he was in Sydney and he stayed at a soup kitchen most of the time. He then went on to Tenterfield and into Queensland where he worked for shearers, and he came back to Sydney in 1894, and it was mentioned that he was living homeless at the time of the Royal Commission in North Shore, Sydney. John Asprey appeared in a court in Cooma in 1896 awaiting admission to the Benevolent Asylum, and the article states, illness of John Asprey. Cooma. John Asprey, who gave evidence in the recent Dean Commission, was brought into town by police yesterday from Buckley's Crossing. He'd been looking for work when he became sick. He gave himself up to the police, stating that he wanted protection. He's 72 years old, very feeble, and he expressed his gratitude to the police for the kindness they showed him. And John Asprey died on the 6th of January 1903. He fell down the stairs at his lodging house where he'd been living for 2 years. And there was a magisterial inquiry held into his death. It says that he was 74, a native of London and a married man who'd been living apart from his wife for a number of years. The inquiry was held at the Builders Arms Hotel and was looking into the circumstances of the death of John Asprey. The evidence showed that shortly after 5 o'clock on the Tuesday evening, the deceased went to his room considerably under the influence of liquor. At 8:45 p.m, a noise was heard, and upon investigation, the other inmates of the house found the deceased lying at the bottom of the stairs in an unconscious condition. Efforts were made to revive him, but he succumbed about 5 minutes later, the cause of death being fracture of the skull and a finding of accidental death. Daniel Gaynor, the father of Mary, Catherine's second child, he was in Pentridge in January 1891, again caught pickpocketing. Listed his aliases as Dennis Edwards and Dennis Gaynor, and also went by the names of George Adams and George James. And the article alluding to his sentencing, a man named Daniel Gaynor was at the City Court this morning, sentenced to 6 months jail with hard labour. On Saturday night, he was caught in the act of stealing a purse containing about 5 shillings from Harriet Dudley. This was at the Eastern Market. Inspector O'Callaghan went into the box and stated he'd known the prisoner for the last 23 years, and he had in the old times been regarded as one of the most expert pickpockets in Melbourne. Daniel Gaynor was recorded as being in Hay, New South Wales in December 1894, and in November 1895 he featured in the Deniliquin, New South Wales court, only an hour away from Hay. Denny Gaynor in court, 3 months under the vague, a surprised criminal. Last week, a man who gave his name as Daniel Gaynor was observed loafing about the town, and as police recognised in him an old acquaintance, a close watch was kept on his movements, but nothing definite could be brought against him, and he was arrested under the very elastic clause of the Vagrant Act. On being arrested, he behaved in a virtuously indignant manner. He was a hard-working man looking for work, he said, and was simply unfortunate in not being able to obtain it. The police, however, were hard-hearted as usual and yanked him off to the logs when he was brought before the court on Wednesday morning protesting his innocence. To such an extent did he endeavour to bamboozle the police that he made a statement from the dock asserting to the purity of his character at the present and for all the time in the past. He was invited to go into the box and give evidence on his own behalf. He accepted the invitation with the air of a deeply injured man, and it was expected that he was going to prove that he was one of the unfortunates who had always been persecuted by the police. After giving evasive evidence to the police magistrate, he was cross-examined, and with some difficulty it was extracted some peculiar information from him. He denied that he was associated with reputed and convicted thieves. He also denied that he had ever been in jail. However, under pressure, he admitted that he had been in for drunkenness and bad language at Rutherglen, Victoria. Further pressure was then applied. He admitted that he'd been in Pentridge and that he was the Denny Gaynor referred in the evidence given before the Royal Commission on the Dean case. He was a former paramour of Mrs. Seymour, the mother of Mrs. Dean. To Gaynor's astonishment, the police magistrate was apparently reading his pedigree from a paper in front of him, and thinking there was a complete exposure and the game was up, he slunk off to the dock. As a matter of fact, the papers looked at by the police magistrate were only blank. Denny thought they contained genuine pedigree of his old exploits as a first-class cracksman in Victoria and elsewhere. He was sentenced to 3 months hard labour in Deniliquin Jail. And there is a jail record of Daniel Gaynor in 1899 when he was charged at Bathurst, and his aliases are listed as George Edwards, John Jones, Daniel Edwards, Charles Edwards and Daniel Seymour. So you'll notice how Carrie had adopted 2 of those surnames for her time as well. Daniel's record stated 12 convictions in Victoria from September 1869 to October 1893. And aside from this charge in Bathurst in October 1899, he'd also been jailed for crimes in Mudgee in June 1899, Cowra July 1900 and Wagga in December 1892, mainly for vagrancy and stealing. I was unable to find a definitive death record for Daniel Gaynor, so I'm unsure of how the rest of his life fared. In July 1896, Catherine Seymour and her daughter Mary were still running a small grocery store shop in Surrey Hills, and she is listed as a fruiter in 1903 in Riley Street under the name Caroline Seymour. And in the commission, there was some information that gleaned as to what Caroline Seymour was doing, possibly aside from running a shop. Tommy Jones, a tailor, was called in the commission, and he was living at the Liverpool Asylum in 1895, but he recalled how when he became too ill to work, Catherine had given him lodgings at her home. He described her as a most kind and motherly woman and as staunch a friend as ever broke the bread of life. Tommy had lived with Mrs. Seymour for 14 years in a home in Riley Street. You may recall, though, that Tommy Jones was mentioned as one of her partners, not only in crime, but also having a relationship with her. And, of course, he didn't divulge this in the commission. One of the biggest surprises in the hearing was the appearance of John Asprey, because Catherine was stunned to see him because she believed that John Asprey had died over 20 years earlier. She was also shocked to see Superintendent O'Callaghan of the Victorian Police, and you would have noticed his name mentioned in quite a few of the charges of the group early on in Victoria. Well, he was brought before the commission and he testified to her character whilst she was living in Victoria. There was an attempt to prove that Mrs. Seymour was a woman of ill repute in order to get George Dean off the charge. And one person in his testimony stated, "I have known Mrs. Seymour for the last 29 years. I first became acquainted with Mrs. Seymour when she was living in North Elizabeth Street, Melbourne. Her name then was Carrie Asprey. I was a frequent visitor to this house, which was a brothel. There were always girls there. After leaving this house, she subsequently kept another brothel higher up in the same street. I was also a frequent visitor to this house. I afterwards visited Mrs. Seymour's place, where she resided in Riley Street, Sydney. Signals were employed by the shape of coloured blinds. When the blinds were blue, anyone could enter. When they were red, it was a signal of danger. Mrs. Seymour would procure girls to the house. I have been to Mrs. Seymour's house over a dozen times in Riley Street and can solemnly say that the house was a brothel. During my acquaintance with Mrs. Seymour, I've known her to live and consort with several convicted thieves and notorious characters, namely Johnny Asprey, William Gamble, Dennis Gaynor, Harry Bryant, Jerry Scanlon and Thomas Jones. Only Asprey was her husband. During my visits to Riley Street, I always saw Mrs. Dean, that's referring to Catherine's daughter Mary. She was a girl about 14 or 15 years. And Walter B. Bolton, a canvasser in the commission, stated that he'd visited Mrs. Seymour's shop and house in Riley Street about 7 years ago. He knew for about 5 years that it was used for immoral purposes. He had been there to the place himself and had gone there with a girl. He had seen girls of loose character there and one from Melbourne that he knew had been a criminal. He was asked, "Did you see the daughter there?" And he said, "Yes, I saw her every time I went. I knew her reputed father, Dennis Gaynor, very well." It was not until after the trial that I found out that Carrie Asprey was in fact Mrs. Seymour. I saw John Asprey in Melbourne and I found him out by taking a message to him from his wife. I never saw him in Sydney and I did not see Gaynor at Mrs. Seymour's house. They asked, "How long have you known Mrs. Seymour's house as a brothel?" And he said, "I cannot say exactly. It was for some years." So Catherine Adams died under the name Caroline Asprey. The name Seymour seemed to have been long discarded in her older years. She died a loving mother and grandmother and was remembered fondly by her family. They had placed memorial notices up to 4 years after her death in the newspapers. And her death notice states, Asprey, December the 28th, 1921, at her daughter's residence, Kent, Rawson Street, Punchbowl, Caroline Asprey, dearly loved mother and mother-in-law of Ben and Mary Bridge, and loving grandma of Bretta and Jack, aged 89 years, and sadly missed. So Catherine certainly led a colourful life and lived till quite a grand old age for those times. So now moving on to Mary and George Dean. So as recorded at the beginning of the podcast, George Dean had been taken to court under the charge of attempted murder. So the claim was that George Dean had tried to poison his wife with arsenic. George Dean was born on the 14th of November 1867 in Albury, New South Wales. He was the son of Irish parents, George Dean, a miner, and his wife Annie, née Byrne. His mother later lived with a man named Finch. At Narrandera, under the name George Finch, Dean, aged 12, was convicted of using a horse illegally on the 28th of November 1879, and he spent 3 months in Wagga Wagga jail as he could not pay the £5 fine. Taken to Sydney by his stepfather, Dean worked for a blacksmith, and in about 1884 he began working for the North Shore Steam Ferry Company. On the 10th of July 1888 he was issued with his master's certificate, and from 1890 he was the master of the Possum, running between Circular Quay and Milson's Point at night. Dean, who was handsome with a trim moustache and a reputation for bravery, was popular with his passengers. Mary Dean was born Sarah Annie Gaynor in Melbourne, Victoria in 1874, and by the time Mary married George Dean at the age of 19 in Sydney in 1894, she was known as Mary Seymour. And Seymour was one of her father Daniel Gaynor's alias surnames. George and Mary married on the 8th of March 1894 at St David's Anglican Church in Surrey Hills. Mary listed her name as Mary Seymour and stated her father was William Seymour, deceased, and her mother Caroline Adams, occupation dealer. Catherine had to give consent to the marriage due to Mary being under 21, and William Seymour could quite easily have been another alias that Daniel Gaynor had used. But interestingly, Daniel was still well and truly alive at this point in 1894. So I'm not sure whether Catherine Adams had told her daughter that her father had died when she was quite young and kept that up throughout Mary's life. The marriage between George and Mary was soon a failure. George Dean states that his mother-in-law interfered quite often as they were living with her. However, Mary did give birth to a daughter, Florence Emily, on the 26th of December 1894 at their home in Miller Street, North Sydney. Not long later, the couple argued as Dean denied the paternity of the child. Florence Dean was later known as Bretta Florence Bridge. Florence was listed as a shop assistant living in Newtown, New South Wales in 1934. And she died unmarried in Sydney on the 27th of January 1990 at the age of 95. So it seems that the longevity, the genes at which Catherine had, have certainly continued with some of the women in this family. In March 1895, the court case on the poisoning was brought up, and it was known as the lemon syrup case, and it created a sensation, and there was a lot of media about it at the time. 27-year-old George Dean denied in court that he'd been seeing another woman and that he may have wanted to marry her. So that was the claim that Mary had given. He and Mary had only been married for 12 months when the poisoning case was entered to in court. Attempts were made in court to besmirch his mother-in-law's reputation, so Catherine Adams's reputation, by linking her to known criminals and brothel owners. There were also claims that Mary herself was a prostitute. One statement said, "I have seen the girl, then Mary Seymour, now Mrs. Dean, both in Crown Street and around the arcades soliciting men at night time on several occasions." There was also a theory that Catherine and Mary had planned this whole case and actually framed George Dean to be charged with attempted murder. And why is this the case? Well, there was a statement saying, "The only feasible thing seems to be to assume that the wife and mother must have been at it, because both of them had a reason for getting rid of the man. The wife because she wanted somebody else, and the mother because he had kicked her out of their home." The respectable old lady at the time Dean was arrested was living at a brothel at McMahon's Point. So when questioned in court, Catherine Adams, now known as Catherine or Caroline Seymour, gave evidence of her past as well. She did admit that she'd been convicted previously and that she'd been married to a man named Ashbury, as it was referred to in the court records. Mrs. Seymour also gave evidence to living in Surrey Hills for 13 years and knowing Madame Rose, a brothel owner across the road, for 9 years, and she admitted to receiving payment for errands that she ran for women at the brothel. George Dean was in fact found guilty in this court case for the attempted murder of his wife by poisoning with arsenic, and he was sentenced to death and sent to Darlinghurst Jail. His cause, though, was taken up by members of the media and by politicians who believed that it was an unjust sentence. The Attorney-General, Mr. Want, even made a statement in which he reported on a forged letter purporting to it being from Mary Dean admitting her guilt. It was noted how popular prejudice had been inflamed so skillfully against Mrs. Dean and her mother, Mrs. Seymour. Mr. Want also released testimony supporting the good character of Mary Dean and her mother. One read, St David's Parsonage, Arthur Street, Surrey Hills, Sydney, April 1895. I have known Mrs. Seymour, late of Riley Street, Surrey Hills, for 10 years or more. I also know her daughter well, Mary Dean, late Mary Seymour, whom I married to George Dean in March 1894. Mary Seymour grew up as a girl in our Sunday school and always bore good character. I never heard a word against her character or that of her mother during her residence here. Signed, Joshua Hargrave. Other friends and neighbours also wrote testaments to Catherine Seymour's industrious, hard-working approach and her kindness to sick neighbours. The Executive Council ended up commuting Dean's death penalty to life imprisonment. Public meetings were held around New South Wales urging the Executive to appoint a commission into Dean's case. They were well organised and well attended, and they raised considerable capital for that cause. And as a result, a Royal Commission was held 2 months after the court case in May 1895. Among others, Captain Thomas Somerville, George's employer, testified that George was trustworthy, honest and courteous to his passengers. And although he was previously sentenced to death, Dean was actually pardoned by the Royal Commission and he was released from Darlinghurst Jail on the 28th of June 1895. A few weeks later, Mary Dean claimed maintenance from her husband and the court ordered that Dean needed to pay her 12 shillings and 6 per week for 6 months. However, George Dean's name did not disappear from the colonial press. On the 4th of October 1895, Dean was again arrested and he confessed in writing a fake letter that he made out to be written by his wife, asking him to be freed. And as a result, he was imprisoned for 14 years for perjury. On the 11th of October 1895, it says, the Council this afternoon of Mr. Want, Attorney-General, read Dean's full and complete confession. I, George Dean, charged on remand, hereby state willingly and without any pressure whatsoever that I am guilty of the charge of perjury. I declare I purchased both arsenic and poison from Smith, the chemist, that I have all through denied my guilt. Further, that I did confess my guilt to Ma in the corridor of the condemned cell at Darlinghurst Jail. I also declare that no other person but Ma and Mr. Green, clerk to Crick and Ma, knew of this confession. The article also added, Mr. Crick, who was interviewed late on Wednesday night, said he wished to point out some things in Dean's confession that were untrue. The man Green was never in the employ of Mr. Crick's firm in any capacity whatsoever. But Mr. Crick said, as far as I am concerned, the matter is ended. It also added, practical sympathy has already been shown to Mrs. Dean and Mrs. Seymour, and in all probability a public subscription will be started on their behalf. 2 appeals by Dean against this perjury conviction failed. So while George was in prison, Mary divorced him on the 1st of September 1896 and gained full custody of their daughter. George Dean was released from Goulburn Jail on the 8th of December 1904. He was remitted for good behaviour and he resumed his position on the ferries and became master of a larger ferry, the Wallaby. By 1913, he was working as an engineer at Canoon Station in Hay, southern New South Wales, and he died of endocarditis in hospital in Hay on the 7th of May 1933 and he's buried in the Hay Cemetery. So an article outlining his death that was in Sydney A message from Hay says that George Dean, principal in the Dean poisoning case, died at Hay Hospital, aged 66, and was buried yesterday. Deceased had been working for many years on Toongimbi and other station properties as a mechanical engineer. He was a reliable and competent workman. And in August 1933, in probate of will, it stated that Arthur George Dean, so incorrectly named, late of Hay engineer, who died on the 7th of May, has been sworn for probate at £2,233, and the estate passes to his daughter. Mary Dean remarried on the 6th of June 1900 at St Peter's Presbyterian Church, North Sydney, to Benjamin William Bridge, who was a resident of Annandale, New South Wales, and a bachelor. On the 15th of May 1902, they had a son, John William, known as Jack, in Redfern. Benjamin listed his occupation as a drover at the time of his son's baptism, and Benjamin died in 1939, aged 66. Mary and Benjamin's son, Jack Bridge, married Mary Emma Brown in Canterbury, New South Wales, on the 2nd of June 1928. They lived at Bankstown, and Jack was a carter in the 1930s. He then enlisted in World War II in the RAAF on the 7th of April 1942 and served in Northern Territory, Melville Island and Groote Eylandt, an island in the Gulf of Carpentaria, as a driver. Jack and Mary had 3 children at the time of his enlistment, 2 daughters and a son. After the war, they lived in Parramatta and Punchbowl, where he was a motor driver. By 1958, they were living at Granville, and Jack was a foreman. And Jack died at Batu Bay, New South Wales, in April 1989, aged 86. And Mary, the centre of the whole story in regards to the court case and her mother, Mary, listed as Mary Ada Bridge, died in 1969 at Gosford, New South Wales, aged 95. So I hope you enjoyed the story, full of a tangled web of people that featured throughout the lives of these women.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes